It's good for Pat and I to be with you this morning, especially on this morning that we are celebrating the ordination of Dale and Jenny. So Dale and Jenny, you know that for us pastors, the reference materials that we're kind of keeping handles on and we turn to, so just for your information, I turn to the commentary in the Believers Church Bible commentary series on 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. And Paul Zare was the author of that particular commentary. So you'll hear his thoughts coming through as I'm sharing with you today. One of the things that just strikes me is this reality that we do what we can do. We do a sense of what we're called to. And then the way in which God kind of comes in and surprises us at times and discovers that lo and behold, God is there with us in the middle of it and working. And we are kind of caught up into that. Several years ago, your search committee started a search process for pastors. And you talked with Dale and Jenny. And Dale and Jenny saw the door open to respond, yes, willing to engage in that, discerning God's will and moving forward. And so today, we acknowledge God's work and we affirm what has been happening and we bless Dale and Jenny as they move into this ongoing role of serving you as pastors. I imagine that as you look back and think about it, you can remember some of those conversations. Often in congregational life, we have to have difficult conversations about times of transition, changes that are happening. And I know you all have engaged in those kind of conversations. So I thank you for the energy that you put into that process that helped to get you to this point today. Thinking back over the last several years, Jenny and Dale, of all people, you know this more than any of us. You know how many meetings you've attended, though you couldn't give that number off just the top of your head. You have a sense of that. You know how many visits you made, how many committees in which you were asked to have some input, the pastoral conversations you had, the sermons you preached, the community contacts that you made, and those little conversations, these discoveries like, oh, you're a pastor? We'll see. Okay. What's the surprise of that? Okay. You know kind of all that. Additionally, you completed STEP, you stayed involved in the family dairy operation, and you became grandparents. That's a busy schedule. Thank you for doing all of that. But it also, as I've heard you in your reflections, I've heard you also just describe the significance of these years that you experienced the surprises and at times the disappointments that go along with ministry. Our text today is this letter from the Apostle Paul to Timothy, two men who are active in ministry together. And Paul, you may have noticed, uses this term, a family term, my beloved child. And this is language that Paul would have also used in writing to Titus. I think it's this idea of this mentor, this person who is equipping younger persons involved in ministry, inviting them in and wanting them to learn with him. And it's understood that at this time, Paul was in prison in Rome. Many of the people who had been with him as support persons have left him, and he is there probably looking at this reality of the likelihood of his death. Paul and Timothy had traveled together as missionaries on Paul's third missionary journey. And if you look in Acts 16 to 19, it's recorded there. Timothy probably is still in Ephesus, where Paul had asked him to stay. And it's thought that that's where Timothy is he gets this letter from Paul. So Paul starts this letter just describing his own good conscience and referencing his ancestors, persons of faith in whose train he was following. And then Paul indicates that he was praying for Timothy day and night. So he was always on his minds, praying for him. He remembered Timothy's tears. Now, it's interesting, when Paul said goodbye to the leaders at Ephesus, there were tears that went along with that. So was that what he was referring to, or was it something else maybe that he was referring to? And then Paul writes towards the end of this letter that he hopes to see him. Come to me by wintertime. Come to me. Paul is also aware of the spiritual ancestry of Timothy, his grandmother Lois, his mother Eunice. And Paul affirms Timothy, saying, I know that faith was in them, and I believe that you also have it. So Paul and Timothy come to this recognizing that they come out of this roll of blessings that have carried them and that they are now in the middle of it, and they will be carrying forward as they move forward. So Paul continues, for this reason, I'm reminding you to fan into flame. That's the way NIV writes it. If you have other translations, you have a King James, you see it says, stir up. NRSV says rekindle. Common English Bible says retrieve. God's gift that is in you through the laying on of my hands. And the verb here is it's a continuing action kind of verb. It's not just something that you do and then like it's done. It's a verb that says you rekindle and you rekindle and you rekindle and you rekindle. It's one of those things that we know needs to just keep happening as time goes on. I was trying to remember and I struck out. Does anybody here at Bethel do blacksmith work? Kurt, I was wondering if maybe you do. No? Okay. Well, but this image of rekindling reminds me a little bit of this blacksmith's forge. To keep the fire hot enough that you can do something with the metal, you need to use bellows to force air in on that fire to get the coals hot enough to create enough heat that the metal gets soft and you can do something with it. When the bellows aren't being used anymore, the fire finishes, you kind of get back to coals and the metal firms up and it's not as pliable. You can't do anything with that. So Paul and Timothy are bringing the gospel of Christ into communities where there's opposition. There were Greek persons who followed Greek gods. There were Jewish persons who were following the Jewish traditions. And Paul warns Timothy. He encourages them to confront teachers of false doctrines. A little later, to avoid godless myths and old wives' tales. And even later in this letter, he mentions a specific person, Alexander the metalworker. And he says that Paul writes that Alexander did me a great deal of harm. And you too should be on your guard against him because he strongly opposed your message. So with this opposition, that Timothy is reminded to remain aware of God's gift to him and keep the bellows going, fan the flame. This isn't the first time that Paul has reminded Timothy that you have a calling and live into it. In the first letter of Timothy, Paul wrote, do not neglect your gift, which is given to you through the prophetic message when the body of elders laid their hands. Paul there writes that Timothy's gift here is the gift of Christian ministry. which includes preaching, teaching, evangelism, modeling Christian living, suffering for the gospel, and relating to opponents with gentleness. So the message to Timothy is remember the gift of pastoral ministry that God has given you, and push the bellows, fan the flame, keep it going. It doesn't appear that Paul is concerned that Timothy has somehow kind of lost the faith in any way, but it's just this awareness that to keep a flame going, you need fuel, you need air, you need oxygen, things that you need to do to keep it going. As Timothy fans the flame, he's reminded that God has not given him the spirit of timidity, but a spirit of power, of love, of self-discipline. So again, this sense of what Timothy does and discovering that God is there, God's already present and invested in Timothy's ministry. God gives the Spirit. It's not just a Timothy job. It's a God in Timothy with God's Spirit working together. And when we think of Spirit, we think of Holy Spirit. Back in the Greek language, as they used it, that word would have also been used for wind. And so we know at Pentecost, when the Spirit came, it was with wind. And so if we kind of work with the bellows image, it's we pump the bellows, but the Spirit is also there blowing, getting caught in those bellows, working, helping to stir that fire with us. And the Spirit gives power, the ability to act, to create, to listen, to discern, to stay present in a difficult situation, to find ways forward in some way. I think even one form of power is what I think of as kind of a holding power. And this ability to be present and resilient as ministry kind of goes ups and downs, but to be present and to be resilient, staying there. It's a kind of power that helps Paul see the uncertainty of his future and continue to share the gospel. That somehow what I'm dealing with today doesn't knock me off my center, okay? That God is still here. I'm still engaged with God, and God is still there with me. I believe that the power demonstrated as you have walked together as a congregation over these last years is a demonstration of that Spirit power that God gives. And Dale and Jenny, I believe that it was Spirit power that opened the doors for you to say yes, to call you to be pastors, and the power that is with you as you serve as pastors. We need to just keep remembering that we live in resurrection power. Many things that would want to shut us down and have us say no. We live in resurrection power. At times that power is demonstrated dramatically, but I think more often it's the ability to just to be present with each other, to listen carefully, to discern, to identify options, to sense this is the way forward, and to go ahead and move ahead as a family of God. And then this text, what's so interesting is with this Spirit of power, there's also love. So what we discern that we need to be doing and moving ahead, we do it with love. Love guides us. It helps to provide the safe barriers. It helps us know what to do moving ahead, that we love, we work out of love. And I sense God's Spirit of power and love has been present in your working together, and Dale and Jenny, in your ministry. together. Love does not mean that everything is smooth all the time. In fact, it's possible for life to appear smooth because we're not doing what we need to do. We're timid. We're not talking about what we need to be talking about, as hard as it is. Okay. But instead, love means that we've experienced God's love and we're called and we're in position that we can share that with each other. And in turn, we can listen deeply. We can work together trying to what it means to follow God in this time. This means having significant conversations and being together as community. Dale and Jenny, I've seen the love of God's Spirit in you. You have a heart for others. You have a desire to see others experience God's goodness in their lives. That's God's love in you. The third thing that this passage mentions is this self-discipline, the spirit of power and love and its self-discipline. Before and as we act in ministry with power and love, we need to practice self-control, self-discipline. Self-control means controlling and being aware of our own thoughts and feelings, the things going on inside us, because we know that we're human, and sometimes those things spill out in ways that we feel bad about later on. So self-control is this idea of being aware and working at making sure that we are thinking wisely and working with wisdom as we relate to each other. One of the things that Paul Zier writes about is the need to think wisely, practice moderation, and be level-headed in the middle of situations that come up, especially difficult times. I believe this is a process that remains necessary throughout our lives. This is true for pastors, it's true for congregational leaders, it's true for everyone who is following Jesus. I imagine we recall the times that we feel like, yes, we kind of missed it on that, and we needed to go back and apologize. Okay, that happens. So yes, we pump the bellows to fan the flame of God's gift. We live and minister knowing that God's with us in power and in love. With the Spirit's guidance, we respond by developing practices of self-discipline so God's work is not impeded. Today, we acknowledge and affirm the gift of ministry God has given Dale and Jenny to be God's servants, pastors to you, the Bethel congregation. We rejoice in that equipping God provides with the spirit of power and love and of self-discipline. And I also want to commend you as a congregation. Sometimes as congregations change, we easily think about how things used to be, or we wonder about what's ahead. Sometimes it's hard just to kind of stay in the this is where we're at kind of thing. Let me share a few thoughts that I gleaned from the most recent issue of the Anabaptist World. This is a magazine, monthly magazine that serves the global Anabaptist movement. The history would be like, we may remember the Gospel Herald, the Mennonite, and now the Anabaptist World. This issue has several stories about small congregations, and I share this to affirm you as Bethel. One of the editorials in this issue quotes a Church of the Brethren pastor, John Fillmore from Idaho. And this is what he writes. A small church is better able to nurture the close relationships that foster mutual care and spiritual growth. And that a small church leaves little room to be merely a spectator or a consumer. Sometimes you might feel that, kind of that sense of, hey, everybody's got to get in to make this happen. He continues, it's time to view smallness not as a problem, but as an alternate route that the Spirit of God wants us to take. He advises three things. First, setting aside our fixation with programs and embracing community. It's kind of that idea. I think I've seen you do it. In my time with you, I'm aware that you weren't necessarily insisting like we have to do it the same way because we did it that way in the past. You've been able to make some changes. And I have the sense that you were working at connecting with each other, responding to each other's needs. You were being community with each other. Secondly, caring for each other instead of expecting the pastor to do it all. And you have actually structurally done that. You know, Ed and Rose doing pastoral visiting. And there's other stuff that you all jump in to make it happen. And thirdly, focusing on being representatives of Jesus in the neighborhood. I think you're already doing these things, being community, being God's loving people to each other, pitching in the congregation's ministry and living as God's lights to your neighbors. Even as things change, God continues to work in and through you. Keep doing it. Keep fanning the flame for those things. Today, as we sang, we celebrate God's faithfulness. Faithfulness to you, the Bethel congregation, to you, Dale and Jenny. Dale and Jenny, in your role, continue to fan the flame. Remembering that's not just, it's a continuing verb. And I appreciate the conversations you've had where you've talked about what you do to make that happen. Continue to fan the flame. Knowing that God's Spirit of power and love and self-control is already here among you, here with you in your role. And for you as a congregation, continue to love and care. Continue to listen to each other. Continue to be God's light to the people that you know. God bless you.